Hi, everyone. I'm Tyler Kingkade. I'm a national reporter with NBC News based in Los Angeles. Welcome to the EWA webinar, Who's Discomfort, covering efforts to limit teaching about racism. If you're on the education beat, you have probably had to do a story that involved critical race theory at some point in the last year. Whether that involved the actual teaching of critical race theory, complaints about it, or something where that term is kind of incorporated into the discussion or controversy that your district, your state, or your beat might be touching on. So today we have Kern from the News and Observer in North Carolina and Eesha from Education Week. They have both been covering this. Eesha's been kind of an expert on the legislation that's been proposed all around the country. Kern covering it in North Carolina. I've been covering it in just trying to cover like the national context. There's a couple like specific communities I've reported more thoroughly on. So I'm going to toss in some thoughts too, and definitely want to get everyone's questions later on as well. So please think of some, get ready to submit them. Really, this is a conversation geared toward reporters and other journalists. So we want to make sure it's really useful for you and that you're leaving this, with some questions answered, or at least maybe some ideas about how to write your next piece. To start off, I want to explain how I started covering this. I am a national reporter. I'm not strictly education these days, but I can never really stray too far from the beat. I actually wrote a story last fall, fall 2020. After the massive protests we saw after George Floyd's murder, I noticed like a lot of schools were getting more involved in rethinking what they should teach about history and what they can do to support social justice. A lot of teachers got really interested in supporting Black Lives Matter at schools, but I also noticed there had been a trend of a lot of local coverage of people getting upset for the display of Black Lives Matter by a teacher, perhaps a banner, perhaps like a t-shirt that they wore, stuff that seemed like somewhat innocuous, but people were complaining that it was too political. I did a story about a fourth grade teacher near Kenosha, Wisconsin, who taught her fourth graders one lesson about just what Black Lives Matter was and showed a video that she had gotten from Teachers Pay Teachers. And that turned into a huge controversy, largely generated through private parent Facebook groups. This was before critical race theory had entered the conversation, really, at least as far as schools. We'll get a little bit more into sort of the history of that term being used for this. Fast forward, a colleague of mine who had just been covering the changing demographics and political leanings of the suburbs did a similar story out of South Lake, Texas. And then I think really by spring 2021, just boom, it was everywhere. It seemed to be as soon as like a lot of the conversations were dying down about mass or remote learning, I guess it was still about mass. That's when we saw a lot more parents going to school boards upset about what they were calling critical race theory. So if you're tuning into this, you probably know what has happened there, and it's splintered off, it's gone in different directions. As I've written about, they've gone after mental health programs. There's a lot of conversation about gender and gender identity. We might touch on that a little bit because it's kind of hard to differentiate, but my understanding is the EWA is kind of trying to figure out a separate panel to go more narrow on that. But that said, that's where it started for me. Eesha, what about you? When did you first do a story that in any way involved critical race theory, or maybe it was like me, like there was something before that you wrote about?
Yeah, so I think I remember also my beat, just to clarify, is covering race and opportunity in education for schools across the country. So I was, I was kind of tracking this when the very early versions of the bills were proposed in last April 2021. I think the first time I wrote about it must have been like late May, early June. And at that point, 4 states had already passed that legislation, and the initial story was just like, these are, some of the these are some of the lessons that could be under threat if this starts to spiral. And at that point, it was just mostly the same language that we've been seeing in all the bills, and it was pretty limited to critical race theory. Now, obviously, it's expanded to equity and gender and sexuality issues and book bans and a lot of other things. But I think when I wrote about it, it was 4 states that had already passed the bills and 15 that had passed it into law, and 15 states that had proposed it. And now, a year later, it's 41 states that have proposed it and 15 states that have passed it. And more bills show up every single day. And so it's really clearly spiraled over the past year, and we've been tracking it as much as we can, especially on my beat. But it's obviously its effects are far reaching.
Yeah, and I've definitely gone back many times to Ed Week to get the latest stats. That handy chart is very helpful. So just want to say your work is appreciated there. Kern, what about you? When did you first start noticing this in your area?
No, first I'll say I'm glad to be here. I'm definitely looking forward to exchange of ideas with the other people here in the session. But just for me, pre-pandemic, well, first off, I cover two things. I cover the Wake County school system, which is the largest school system in the state, which covers Raleigh. And I also cover more general level statewide issues in North Carolina for K-12. But pre-pandemic, we usually, the stories, if I dealt with anything, it wasn't called critical race theory then, but it was usually dealt with anytime schools were dealing with diversity and equity training sessions. We had, a few years ago, we had a spate of issues where students were posting videos, Instagram posts, and various other things. They were basically using the N-word, making racially offensive remarks. So that would usually lead to schools saying they need to do more to provide training to school administrators on how to address those issues. But I guess I started really noticing, talk about critical race theory right after the pandemic started. I don't think it's a coincidence, the fact that starting in the spring of 2020 into the fall of the year, the situation where, because of the COVID restrictions, most kids were learning from home, and most parents at that point were still also working from home. So you'd have parents who'd be wandering in, and if they heard something that they thought was inappropriate, they would be quick to point it out. And so I was regularly starting to hear from parents complain, why are you teaching this? Why are you talking about George Floyd? Why are you talking about Black Lives Matter? And it's definitely picked up. We've had this legislature pass legislation to try to, what they said was designed to discourage critical race theory, but that legislation was vetoed by the governor, and it's in a holding pattern. So what you've now seen is that several districts around the state in more, I would say, more rural, more conservative areas have passed their own bills, which they say are, well, their own policies are designed to try to they put limits on how the issue should be taught. So yeah, it's a recurring issue, and as we head into this fall's elections with school board and state and federal, it's only going to get more intense.
Yeah, well, for you, Kern, covering the local community, what's been kind of the tough part for you to navigate? Is there a certain side of the debate? Is it, I guess, pro DEI versus like the anti-DEI, anti-CRT side? Is that how you see it? Do you see it as being primarily between these parent activists and administrators? How do you navigate? Because you were just talking about, like, there have been issues where students were facing hostile environment and racist harassment. So those concerns are still there, and you know them from covering them. What's been difficult about navigating this over the last year for you, if anything? I guess.
Oh, well, I mean,
you're a pro, obviously, but what's been kind of the tough part?
Well, I'll give you an example. Recently, we had a situation in which a parent complained that students at their child's middle school, they held a slave auction, essentially where the members of the baseball team were out and they separated up by race and they started literally auctioning off the black kids. And the parent complained, and I wrote stories about that. And as soon as the stories came out, I had these parents, these other people, people contacting me saying, those kids must be doing a Jesse Smollett. They must be lying about this because the school district was saying they're investigating, they wouldn't comment it. Eventually, they did their investigation. They confirmed that it occurred. They claimed that the coach had nothing to do with it, and now they're saying they're going to adopt these policies, which they seem to try to promote racial understanding. But it's the kind of thing where if either you write about these issues, you are going to get hammered by people. I have plenty of emails and people on social media saying, I obviously was part of the effort to make this up in order to try to shame white people. It's like, no, I'm just reporting about an incident that occurred and what that says about the state of racial relations in North Carolina at this point. But those are the kinds of things. And honestly, what's been frustrating for me, especially during the pandemic, is I don't have the level of classroom access I had 2 years ago. It's getting better now where I can actually be around schools more, be in classroom, be talking to people, but it's complicated things in terms of having as much access as I did talking to students, talking to teachers, and just being able to get that level of what I enjoyed pre-pandemic.
Yeah. Eesha, what about you? I mean, the legislation in particular has been, it's always, I think for me, when we mention it, like I'm trying to figure out like, how can you summarize it? Because it can be like about CRT, but never say that. And then there's like, sometimes I look at it and I see something as like, it's going to ban teaching that anyone should feel guilt or shame about something. But I'm like, well, how do you prove that? And so how do you navigate that? How do you figure out like how to describe what a bill is intended to do and what it would actually do?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question that journalists ask themselves actually when covering these bills, because often, the reaction to these bills and how it'll impact students and parents and teachers is very important. But what the language of the bill in your specific state actually says is going to dictate how it impacts, your coverage. So it's crucial to like actually read the bill, I think, and that's been kind of what I've been doing for a few states, including Florida, Tennessee, Oklahoma. A lot of these bills have a list of 8 to 12 concepts, and sometimes they're called divisive concepts, and you can't teach them. Like you can't use them in like professional development or in classroom instruction. And as you said, they include some of these vague terms, like you cannot teach that someone should feel guilt or anguish for their race or sex or any actions in the past committed by members of their race or sex, or that no one should be that no one is inherently racist because of their race or sex, or that there's just these like terminologies, and a lot of them are not being taught in schools. Like I don't think any teachers are saying you're inherently racist because you're white. Like I don't think there's like much risk of violating the exact language of the law, but the way that the law could be interpreted in almost every state is so vague that it is creating this kind of chilling effect that teachers and even district leaders are preemptively directing themselves or their employees to stay away from lessons on race and racism because of the language of the laws being so vague. They don't want to risk violating it and or getting parent complaints and angry people at school board meetings. And so what's the consequence of the vague language is that lessons on race are being preemptively avoided, which is obviously, a loss to student learning everywhere.
Yeah, well, how do you figure out like what the impact would be then? Like what strategies have you used to figure out like how it would play out on the ground?
So specific states, I've talked to large districts that have either, a lot of these, when these laws were being passed, a lot of leaders spoke at the state houses when these bills were being debated. So I found some of them because they've displayed, their interest and stake in these bills and their passage. So spoke to some of them about how they plan on addressing those laws, and some of the districts have done like trainings for their teachers to try and interpret the laws for them. So I've like reported on some of that. Also spoken with school board associations because they have legal teams, or they have some attorneys or legal experts consulting with them. So tried to talk to them to try and understand, what the laws will mean in terms of like legal consequences for schools. So I think the strategy has been just to like decipher it as much as possible from the perspective of school leaders and lawyers to see how it can be implemented. But I have to tell you, despite all that reporting, I think the general consensus is that the laws are confusing and vague.
Yeah, and I found too, like putting it in context, the recent Jill Lepore piece in the New Yorker that compared this with the battle over evolution, almost exactly, it was exactly 100 years ago. Seeing like just, I think she had a line about how many states had proposed similar restrictions on teaching evolution. I thought that was really striking to me too, just to help understand like, it might not be the exact same, but there are similarities that have happened before, and make from it what you will. Kern, what's one thing like I've noticed when I've talked to school boards is I'll ask them some questions that I'm trying to kind of understand where the parents that are involved in this activism are coming from and where they have frustrations. And I see a lot of these videos of them going through all their complaints, or sometimes they're saying things that seem doubtful, but sometimes I can understand, okay, maybe they genuinely think that like that is something they heard about and they want an answer, but then the school board just kind of sits there and listens and then doesn't really respond. And I hear parents say, well, if it's not true, why didn't they just say, no, that's not true? And then the school board will tell me, well, we actually have limits on what we can address if it's not on our agenda. What are some of the nuances like that that you have had to deal with in your beat?
Well, now to the fact that usually the school districts will say that it's not their policy to respond to public comments at meetings. There are definitely times when I've heard stuff said at meetings where I will not immediately write a story that day. There are times I will because I know enough of the background and context I can work around it. But there are times if they're going to make maybe certain allegations or certain charges, I will usually take more time to research it and then come back and do another story. Like I guess an example might be some parents showed up, and this is a thing you've probably seen in your school boards where you're at, where a group showed up. They said, we're going to file surety bond notices against you unless you stop teaching critical race theory, unless you stop requiring that masking, unless you stop encouraging students to get the vaccine. When that happened, I didn't immediately write the story. Took time to research it, and then when I did research, I found out it was part of a national effort that was being organized to get these parents to show up around the country using this list of suggested research policies and suggested wording, and they were organizing, and then I was able to provide more context into it. I mean, I guess I could have written a quick hit story saying, oh, these parents showed up and gave the school board 72 hours to end masking, or they're going to go after their insurance policy. But I didn't. In that case, I figured I could take my time to do it, and I think I came out with a better story as a consequence. I also wanted to just say what Eesha mentioned about how the chilling effect. I covered K-12 education now for over 20 years, and this is basically really the first time in more than 20 years where I've had teachers who will be bold enough to say anything to me are now don't want to talk because they're scared about that if they say anything, they're going to get targeted on social media and people are going to go after them. One of the school districts, which I wrote story where they had to pass the policy on limiting the CRT. The result is now that the county historical person who used to go around the schools talking about things such as that there used to be slave trading done right across the street from where the schools are. He won't speak at school anymore because he's scared that if he shows up at a school, it will cause the teacher and the principal to potentially get disciplined. I mean, that's the kind of climate that I've never seen before, but it's occurring now in schools. And I don't think what I'm seeing here is an isolated situation.
Yeah, I mean, about the surety bonds, like that was something I covered too, and that was something that was new to me about it. And I saw some, I've seen other people cover it as well, and I think most of the coverage I've seen has been pretty good in explaining. Basically, it's not a thing. They're more or less they're insurance policies that citizens can't file anything under. But I worked with a colleague here who we it's part of a sovereign citizen tactic, and we kind of went down a rabbit hole of some of the same places that the QAnon folks would hang out in, certain channels on Telegram, and they would just kind of broadcast exactly what they were doing. Telegram, if anyone hasn't used it yet, you can just sign up. You can hop in. It's not like it's not very. You don't have to say anything. You can jump into these groups usually without needing to do a request like a Facebook private group. I mean, for me, that's been one of the challenges. Is sometimes like I'm told about stuff that's happening or being organized in a private Facebook group, and I've requested to get into some to look at them, see what the conversations are like. I never do a fake profile for that because I kind of feel like it's a little unethical in that sense. So I don't hide anything. My profile says I'm a reporter. It's got my face. If they let me in, they let me in. Sometimes the organizers will actually, or the moderators will respond to me and say, "What do you want to know?" And then that could open up a conversation. But yeah, I would also say, spinning off of what Kern was just saying about not writing something immediately, some of the good reporting I've seen from papers, I want to say in Tennessee and Kentucky, for example, have been taking statements that lawmakers say that, let's say, for example, there was one I read that a lawmaker said a elementary school child was forced to renounce their whiteness, and a reporter hounded him to figure out what district did that come from, who said that, so that they could then go track that down and maybe find that incident, maybe explain what happened, and if it's true, then yeah, why would any child be forced to renounce their identity? But they couldn't find it, and I thought that was really, really good to drill down into some of this. Another example I'll quickly cite, and it's a little off topic, but this week the Utah governor put out a statement about why he was vetoing a bill dealing with trans students in sports. He mentioned at the end of it that how many trans students were actually playing school sports, according to data that his office had. And there was one athlete, there were 4 total, but one athlete where it was where it was contentious, essentially. I thought that was such important context to explain, like, how this kind of spirals into legislation that passes 2 chambers without, as if it's this massive problem sweeping every district, when in reality it's a couple cases and we don't know the context of it. Eesha, I'm going to take that to go to you. How do you sort through the arguments that are made in favor of certain legislation and kind of figuring out sort of, I guess, what opinions to include versus what you maybe leave out because what they're saying isn't true or you can't verify it? How do you sort through that?
Yeah. So I actually haven't in general talked to too many lawmakers for my stories. I've collaborated with some people who have done that, but as you said, I think if you cannot verify some of the allegations they're making, then you don't include that opinion. And sometimes it also involves like pushing back during the interview, because a lot of these the discrepancy lies between is like what they think is happening, some of these people that are proposing these laws, and what is actually happening in schools. Like I think like if anyone walks into a school, the like fear of indoctrination that some of these lawmakers hold is not actually true. And so you know, pushing back with like what's actually being taught in districts, sometimes telling them what lessons are included in the history classes and in English classes as opposed to what they are seeing in the state houses, or you know, well, the same with the book bans. Like a lot of people are afraid of like books containing certain material, and if like what I found is if you just explain factually, like actually this book, you know, is about like a broader theme, and like what you're worried about is like maybe some out of context sentences on one page, and so it's not always received super well. But I think just like sticking to facts as much as you can, and like taking, I don't know, like taking the emotional and the political argument out of the whole context, I think is the best strategy.
Yeah. So one thing that I think if you've covered this, or maybe if you're just working in journalism, period, in 2022, you have probably dealt with some blowback. Some of it can be pretty nasty on social media, emails, hopefully not beyond that. I think we've all dealt with it. I think I know that my colleagues that are people of color or women deal with it much worse than I do as a white dude. But still, it sucks. Doesn't matter who you are. We don't like it. I've gotten, you know, I've dealt with like the range of it, from trolling and sort of threatening, harassing messages, to just, you know, people that disagree with and push back on your story and don't like the premise and maybe write their own take on your story. And I've gotten that part of it from both sides. People saying you need to call all of these, you know, this is all part of a Koch brothers operation. And then other people saying you're disparaging parents and saying we're all racist. I mean, I think for me, I always say, you know, if you find an error, please tell me. I mean, we're happy to make corrections. I think everyone also kind of deals with it in different ways. I actually just did a story about doctors facing harassment for advocating for anti-racism policies. Some of them told me that they catalog it all. Some of them told me that they just block everybody on Twitter. And some of them told me they just bow out of social media altogether. I don't have personally a prescription for that. But I do know, like with the story, I always try to think before publishing, and I talk with my editor about it, like, what could we get pushback from on both sides of this? And want to make sure that we maybe think ahead of that and try to dispel anything, but also like not go too far down a rabbit hole of, you know, debunking every claim we've ever heard. All that said, I guess I'll start with Kern. Kern, what have you had to deal with, and how do you deal with it after the story is out? Like, what are you getting pushback in your local community? Is it online? And, you know, how do you deal with that, in either personally or in your newsroom?
Well, honestly, in 2022, it's not getting attacked on social media. I mean, that's pretty much the norm, just as you breathe. But yeah, in my case, it's kind of a little other than like, I mean, I've had people, you know, call me, you know, because I'm, have people call me a commie online, and I just, you know, whatever. But I'm mindful of the fact that because I am writing about issues which are going to be sensitive in nature, that I have to some degree check myself, always try to remember to check myself in terms of what I say or how I tweet things. For example, my main social media thing is Twitter. I have a Facebook account for work, but I don't use it as much. I mainly use Twitter, and I will, especially one of the things I like to do is I live tweet from meetings. And live tweeting from meetings can be good and it can be bad, because you can imagine what's said at public comment in the school board meeting in 2022. But it does mean I'm making sure that when I'm tweeting is, and I've gotten some grief from people who say I should be tweeting what some people are saying, but I make sure to try to make something right to tweet it out in a way that is somewhat is neutral, that I am not like saying, oh, this person is crazy, although I may personally think that what they're saying is crazy, but I try to keep it as the balance. When I'm not tweeting about us, I don't tweet about things which I know which would be considered as personal opinions. I you know, sometimes, especially for some maybe younger journalists who they don't realize, you know, people aren't going to say if you tweet something about Trump or Biden, people say post they're not going to say, oh, that's just you tweeting about it because you personally believe. They're going to just assume that because you're a journalist, what you're tweeting is how you're covering it. So I have to make sure that I am careful about how I tweet things. And I think hopefully it's led to people who, when they're not maybe always happy for what I'm saying or tweeting, this thing goes, I'm trying to be as balanced a truth giver as I can be under the circumstances.
Yeah, I'm just going to kick the same question over to Eesha. What do you do? How are you handling it in 2022?
Yeah, I think my rule for responding to what social media or email feedback to my articles, however, you know, tame or nasty, is it going to lead to like a productive discussion? Because responding to trolls is just going to be pointless, and some people just want to yell at you and misconstrue what you're writing because they're mad about something that is pretty much unrelated to what your story is about. And so in those cases, I don't think there's a need for a response because it's just going to spiral. But a lot of people actually, you know, like sometimes they just need clarification on something that they're unaware of the context for, and sometimes they want to like genuinely ask you a question, but like they have a bias that they're going with in terms of writing to you. So I try to answer it as you know, neutrally as possible. Sometimes I'll link to other articles, be it from Education Week or somewhere else. And a lot of times I've seen like an angry initial email turn into like a productive discussion and you know, lead to the person who emailed me actually getting some information. So I'm not always opposed to responding. When it's on social media, I do try to avoid it because I've realized that people there don't care about your response as much as they just want to have their opinion shouted into the abyss, and I don't want to deal with that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I didn't mean to cut you off if you had more.
No, that's it.
Okay. Yeah, and you know, one of the other things too, I try to be mindful about with like when we talk about harassment too, is like what are the students dealing with? Because I think if there's anything I would critique our whole field at, it's that I don't think there's been a lot of enough um, enough voices of students in the coverage, and I just mean that writ large. I would include ourselves. I'm at NBC. I've tried to do it a little bit where like I've looked into students that have been protesting against racist incidents they've been dealing with in 2021. You know, obviously it's very, it can be very sensitive. So I think this is, you know, possibly one of those areas where, you know, talk with your editor, figure out your own policies, but, you know, give people some anonymity, but, you know, then try to reach a critical mass of anonymous folks. We've also tried to like here, for example, like look at demographic shifting, because I had noticed in just a couple of the places we'd zoomed in on, they had become basically much less white over the past 20 years. And so we did like basically a study that some professors at later did a much bigger version of, that showed like a lot of these districts do have changing demographics. And I think that's important to like understand what are the students living through, because a lot of these conversations can be basically about what parents are interpreting isn't a lesson plan. So I'll just, and we're going to get to questions after this, but Kern, what are some of the contexts that you think you either try to include in your own reporting or that you think reporters at large need to be mindful of?
Well, definitely we need to get we need to get more context. We also definitely need to get more of the context from students of color. And that's one of the things we're trying to do in our newsroom is, we did an audit of who we were talking to, and unfortunately, we just that the vast majority of the people we were talking to were only white people, and we were getting enough perspectives from people of color. We weren't getting enough perspectives from the LGBTQ community. And in a world where well, especially in public schools where you've now got, with North Carolina, the majority of the students are no longer white. We have a responsibility to make sure that when we write stories that we reflect those views, that we have some discussion of the concerns they have, because the concerns that these students are, the challenges they face are not going to be the same as the challenges that some the white affluent families. And in this, if we're going to be still relevant, we have to make sure that our coverage is getting all these perspectives in there, or else we're just going to be an echo chamber where the only people who read us are going to be the dying readers who used to read our printed editions 20 years ago. We need to keep adapting and make sure that we're staying up there and reflecting who the society is nowadays.
Yeah, and I mean, I think too, it's like you also want to have like the ideological diversity. I mean, not like a false dichotomy. It's not like climate change where like, okay, here's someone who says climate change is real and here's someone who says it's not, and look at us, we're fair and balanced. But like, if there really are like a bunch of parents showing up at a district, like, okay, what are their concerns? Is there a larger context to understand? Eesha, same question to you. What context do you find to be really important that people consider when covering these issues?
Yeah, I think it is really important to understand that this is now become a political argument, and as we were talking about earlier, that this is going to probably play out in the elections. It's what we're learning and teaching in schools has now become an issue of national political debate, and a lot of the people that are the loudest voices are fighting because they have a political stake in the argument. We can see that sometimes when people show up at school board meetings and they don't have a kid in the school system or are not affiliated with the school system at all, and it's just a political argument that they have to win. And that is important because you have to think about whether you want those voices to be included in your story, because if you're an education reporter like me, you're writing about what happens, you're writing about the school system and what has an impact on these students, and someone who just wants to be loud at a school board meeting but has no stake in it is not really relevant. And so political context is important. Also, this is far from the first time that there has been a pushback to equity in schools or lessons on race and racism. A lot of the equity officers across the country have experienced this from the day that they started doing their jobs. This is not, I mean, it's unprecedented in the level of national, momentum behind the pushback against lessons on race and racism, but it's not the first time that this has happened. So as you mentioned earlier, there's definitely some lessons we can learn from history on how this all moves on, and we'll see that after the elections are done this year, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, sort of the two things can be true at the same time. I mean, it can be a political ploy. Republicans have said they're going to run with the culture war issues for the midterms. I mean, there's plenty of reporting out there on that, but it doesn't mean like every parent showing up is like getting a salary from someone, in DC. And so like, what is it that drove them to be uncomfortable? Has a school or teacher made a mistake? And are people getting things wrong, like what the definition of equity is? I think, there's a lot of nuance we can have, but let's get some questions in, because like I said, I want to make sure it's helpful for reporters watching this so we can all do a better job. Eesha, what do we have?
Hi, my name is Eesha, and I'm an intern for EWA, and I'm just going to cover the Q&A segment of this webinar. So this question is for Eesha and Kern. Have you interviewed parents who are against CRT or divisive concepts? If so, have you asked them to provide an example of what CRT or divisive concepts look like in the classroom, and what were your responses?
Actually, yeah, I've definitely talked to parents. Honestly, usually more often than not, they'll talk about how the school district sponsored a training session where they had discussions about concepts such as white privilege, and they will talk about how they're concerned that that is going to seep its way into the classroom and result in their children's teachers telling them that their kids should feel guilty for what happened 200 years ago. And so, I mean, those are the kinds of things training and relate that how that's occurred. But actually, in terms of what actually is in the classroom, it's basically if a teacher mentions anything to do with Black Lives Matter, that automatically is considered by some parents, oh, that must mean they're teaching about critical race theory. Or if they're doing anything that mentions reading a book that has an LGBT character, it usually is with some parents is code traces that the schools are trying to promote an LGBTQ agenda, and it's trying to find the context of what they're saying versus what the school district says they're trying to do by discussing that material. And it's not easy, but it's definitely something that you have to present to the readers to understand what actually is occurring.
Yeah, I will just say I've had conversations too with parents who have objected to this. Some of it's been very illuminating to, they will tell me that they organize with members of their county Republican party and confirm certain things about that. Some of them have said things about when I asking about they'll say, look, I'm all against racism, and if there's racists out there, let's go get them, but I don't know what you're talking about, and my kid who's white has been discriminated against for being white. And that was a comment I left out because we couldn't confirm that, and it was a sort of a debate we had in the editing process of do we quote someone saying that and let readers kind of see what it is? Do we leave it out because it's just a little bit of noise? I don't think there's a hard and fast answer to that, but I do think it's important to always try to get those parents in to talk to you as well.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it is often also not about any parents on any side of this issue trying to define what CRT is. It's always about what their kid is doing in that's their specific class. It's way more narrow than that. I've not really. I don't think it is. For me, I don't think I've tried to ask parents to nail down what exactly CRT is, because there's been that term has been so overused and misused over the past year that we do not need opinions of what people think it is, because there is a very clear-cut definition whether people choose to accept it or not. So that's not really the conversation I'm trying to have with the parent. I'm just trying to understand what they are specifically concerned about. And the answer is not often as broad as CRT. The answer is more specific, like my kid is learning this specific thing about in history class that I'm uncomfortable with, or they have access to a book that I don't enjoy. It's more specific than CRT, and so are my questions.
Okay, and this next question is from JP Goldman. Have you filed FOIA requests to get information from school districts on these issues? And if so, do you think the heavy barrage of nuisance FOIA requests to school boards and superintendents from conservative groups have gummed up the process for legitimate media requests?
That's an interesting question. I will just say if the question is have we done FOIAs to find out what they're teaching and some of the same things that parents submit FOIAs over, I haven't done that. I have done records requests to see what sort of communications are happening between some of these activist groups and the schools, because they'll make a claim that, you know, well, I asked the school this and they wouldn't tell me, and I'll try to fact check that. Other times I've been requesting to see how are they dealing with it internally, how are they communicating behind the scenes about how they want to respond or not respond, or what are they doing. I've used FOIA requests to figure out how they're dealing with harassment and to get us insight on the harassment that they're dealing with. But that's what I've done. It's hard to say whether the nuisance requests have gummed things up or not. I think it probably depends on the district.
I mean, I may cheat on this, but I request to see what other people are requesting, and when there's requests come in, I think I wanted to get to see what to get the data that other people are getting. But yeah, in terms of the requests, I know, for example, Wake County, which I covered, they have, because of the volume of requests they've gotten, they actually have started charging an access fee. Sure. To charge for the cost of people reviewing and redacting records, which it's legally allowed, although obviously it's a touchy issue. You know, making people say you have to pay $25 an hour for a clerk to be able to go through this record just to make sure that they're not saying something that might violate FERPA. And obviously that can add up depending on the volume of requests. Yeah, I would ask what the other journalists in your market are asking for in their requests too, because it's one quickie way to just make sure you're not suddenly blindsided and find out that this other outlet's got the story you had no idea was coming.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I haven't done school level requests. I mostly deal with states when I'm requesting information, but yeah, I don't have much experience with district level FOIA requests.
Actually, it's a good pivot because this next question, I guess it's for Eesha, from Natalie Wexler. It says that you mentioned that most of these laws ban teaching, that anyone should feel discomfort, guilt, etc. And yet they're often reported as banning teaching about anything that might make students feel discomfort, etc. Do you think that there's a significant difference between the actual language and the way that it's being described? If it were being described accurately, might there be less of a chilling effect?
So I do think, for the first part of your question, I do think sometimes there can be a discrepancy between the way the laws are being interpreted and the way they're actually written. And for that reason, I think it's important to cite the actual direct language from the law in whatever state you're covering. It's just the best way to avoid any sort of confusion. And if reporters are not clear on what the law means, because it's not written in the most, it's not written clearly. So I recommend always asking like a legal expert or a school board, like association member or someone to provide an interpretation. And that interpretation is also not going to be perfect, because it's one expert's interpretation. So I think being careful about what exactly is reported on in terms of like what the law says and doesn't say is important. I don't know if it'll necessarily impact the chilling effect, because from what I heard when I was speaking with teachers is that it almost doesn't matter whether there is a law in your state or not. There was a report that a few UCLA researchers did that said that a lot of suburban school districts have been facing parents and angry responses at school board meetings, whether or not their state has a law banning or restricting conversations on race and racism, because of the perceived threat. And that threat can manifest in like a teacher being fired or suspended or reprimanded, even if the state doesn't have a law. Because at this point, the state having a law is just an additional factor but a school district can decide to walk back their equity efforts, can decide to limit what teachers can and can't teach, just because of the fear of being, called out, and to like the fear of having to face all this pushback. So while it is 100% important to clarify the exact language of the law, it's also important to understand that just by doing that, I don't think you're going to mitigate the chilling effect. I think that is just built up by the national fear, which in many cases is warranted, of what can happen if you have those conversations in classrooms now.
And now we have another question from Ellie Richard. Do you find yourselves referencing ALEC, the context of how efforts to limit real history, sensitive topics are so vastly distributed and emboldened?
I don't find myself looking into ALEC. I haven't necessarily seen a connection there. What I saw and read about early last year was that there had been an organizing by the Manhattan Institute and the Heritage Foundation. They were some of the early players who really got this churning. And then I found from talking to people running No Left Turn in Education, for example, that they've been having conversations with lawmakers. And if you look at the language, a lot of it emulates back to the President Trump's executive order from September 2020 that took aim at trainings, diversity and bias trainings for federal agencies and contractors. And so a lot of it just kind of goes from there, but like there's been a plethora of groups that have popped up that are pushing this fight. There's Stephen Miller's group. There's one by a man named Ryan Gerdsky. I might be mispronouncing his name. And there's been reporting on this, and those are some of the groups that if you're trying to trace back where it comes from, I would just look at those. And a lot of times there might be a webinar that they've done that might be on YouTube or something that they've written. I mean, there's probably more that we don't know that's behind the scenes, but a lot of it is kind of out there.
And for our audience members, can you go in more detail about what ALEC is?
Yeah, ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. They draft a lot of model bills that mostly conservative lawmakers or right of center lawmakers will use. And you know, one thing that I've also heard from like teachers unions and some administrators is they see a lot of overlap between this and people who are pro school choice or pro private schools, private charters. I think that's one area to explore more. I'm not super familiar with that, but you know, I think that there's certainly some there's more people could pursue there.
So the three organizations, there's many more, but the model legislation, the first instance that we saw this this legislation was President Trump's executive order, which when President Biden came into office, he revoked. But a lot of the model legislation from that executive order is now in these laws. There's a few groups that are like advocating for their own model legislation. Some of that has been interpreted in these laws, like such as Citizens for Renewing America is one of them. All of these are right-wing advocacy groups. Another one is I think it's called Alliance for Free Citizens. There's a few groups that like the Alliance for Free Citizens is the one that targeted the 1619 project specifically. So the legislation that we see now is kind of a patchwork of the original executive order and some of the model legislation put forward by these groups.
I've also dealt with Moms for Liberty, and as you sort of brought the Alliance, I mean, I'm seeing a school board candidates relying on basically the same platform of they want to ban what they say are obscene books from schools. They want to make face masks optional. They want to ban CRT. And so it's all part of essentially a unified political platform that we're going to see a lot more of in the elections going forward.
Yep.
Okay, this next question is from Gail Robinson. I guess it's, whoever wants to answer. The attack on teaching of sensitive subjects in America's past and present is happening after years when many school systems de-emphasize teaching history and civics. I'm wondering whether the school systems you covered have done that, or are continuing to do it. How you think these two trends might be connected?
So the question is, are school districts still continuing to teach about race and racism despite the efforts to restrict? Okay. I've seen some districts that are actually taken on this challenge as a new, taken on this like limit to the lessons as a new challenge and doubled down on lessons about race and racism. These districts are not, they're the exception, not the rule, but there are certainly some districts like that. And to do that, your district leader really needs to be willing and able to take on whatever criticism or whatever complaints they might face. But just an example, in Oklahoma, there's a district in Oklahoma City called Millwood. Their superintendent has been consistently vocal that they're going to continue the lessons that they're going to teach. And a lot of large urban school districts have actually doubled down on the fact that they will not stop teaching anything that they were teaching, and a lot of smaller districts often face the most challenges when it comes to that. But there are certainly districts scattered across the country that have made it known that this fear is not going to impact what they teach.
As for me, I mean, it's got to vary by district. I've got one district which is somewhat in our coverage area where they're doubling down. They're using the 1619 project. They're encouraging their teachers to have these discussions. And I've got another district. Let me see if I can just pull this up here. They passed a policy which says that school teachers should teach all people who contributed to American society will be recognized and presented as reformists, innovators, and heroes to our culture. So, and if you're a teacher in that district, and I've talked to some teachers, like, how are you supposed to teach that? How are you going to be able to discuss Andrew Jackson, the Trail of Tears, when you're supposed to be talking about people as heroes? And so it's we got these places where there are questions about how much these teachers will be able to continue what they have been doing before, when you've got these policies in place which are governing what, or at least making things vague enough that they're not sure how to proceed.
Yeah, and I just add, kind of going the other way, in terms of, but this goes back to the earlier question about the effect of the laws, whether they are passed and whether they, despite how explicit they are. There's been some good reporting from like the Washington Post. We've had some coverage of this too, of schools pulling books preemptively, and just because they want to get ahead of it, because they don't want to end up on Fox News, they don't want to end up on Tucker Carlson, or go viral for anything. So I think that's also definitely real. Is there are going to be things that happen behind the scenes, and it'll be up to us reporters to figure out how that plays out. Oh, Kim, we can't hear you.
Kim, you're muted.
I know. It wouldn't be a webinar if somebody wasn't muted.
Yeah.
I just want to thank everybody. Tyler, thanks for being our moderator and our super moderator, actually, for knowing so much and asking such great questions. And Eesha and Kern, thank you so much for your wisdom. You will, once this is over, you will get a little pop-up survey. We hope that you'll fill it out, because we actually do read them and try to make our offerings better as a result of your feedback. Before you leave, I do want to mention that EWA is taking applications now for our fellowships of up to $10,000 for that can fund very ambitious education reporting projects. So if you have a great idea, if this webinar inspired you to try to file those FOIAs or find out actually who is making students feel, quote, uncomfortable, or what is discomfort in your community, We would be very interested in those. So please take a look at the ewa.org website and check out the fellowship applications. And don't forget that in July, we're holding our national seminar, our 75th anniversary. So I hope that you'll show up. Journalists can get travel scholarships, so you get a free trip to Orlando in July. So I hope you'll join us there. Thanks, everybody, and thanks very much to our guests. Thank you very much.
Bye.